Okay, I'd like to welcome you all. I'm Rick Williams, a professor in ocean sciences at Liverpool University. So at this time of COVID, we're embarking on a series of conversations from the university with the wider community. So the one today is a central issue. It's about climate change. And so what we're doing today is we're having experts provide a perspective on their work, drawing on the core science, the societal response, and the solutions. So this is recorded and being streamed also to Facebook. There's an opportunity, and indeed we want to engage with the audience and for you to provide questions via the Q&A box on Zoom or in the comments book via Facebook. So, as I said, the university is embarking on addressing this challenge and has done for some time. We've got a research challenge called Climate Futures, which is addressing core issues of the science, society, and solutions. And so I'll be talking about the core science, Professor Mark Boyle on the societal response, Dr. Jenny Hodgson on the ecological response, and Professor Carl Whittle on some solutions. So I'll kick off now on the science. And so there's some parts of this problem that are absolutely clear. Over all of our lifetimes, the concentration of atmospheric CO2 has risen. Over my lifetime, it's a 22% increase in the concentration of this gas. So that has definitely happened. What does it do? It leads to a small amount of extra heating. I've got this, my prop is this 3-watt LED light bulb. The extra concentration of this gas is like leaving one of these LED light bulbs every meter squared left turned on. So this is actually quite a small effect in itself. There are many more important processes that affect our weather and our climate system on shorter timescales. Changes between the atmosphere and the ocean, volcanic emissions, sometimes even sunspots. But decade on decade, leaving these light bulbs left on, this extra heating from carbon dioxide leads to a systematic effect. So since the pre-industrial era, we are 1.1 degrees warmer as a global average in terms of surface temperature. When we use tools like climate models to speculate as to what our future holds, they provide a very clear message. And that message is the more carbon we emit, the warmer it will become. We're on track to reach 1.5 degrees in less than 16 years' time, probably to reach 2 degrees warmer by 30 years' time. So we need to investigate ways of addressing this. And really, it's all about behavioral change, how we choose to organize our lives, and structural change. How do we produce and use energy to, and carbon, how that's involved in that process, all linked to the basic things that we do, how we move around, how we keep warm, how we eat, how we use our habitat. This is very daunting. This is a really fundamental challenge, actually bigger than the present crisis that we're dealing with COVID. this challenge is a generational challenge. Now, I'd just like to end by saying we have in the past solved other problems. The London smog in the 1950s, the banning of CFCs, which was destroying the ozone layer, and the expansion in recycling. So we shouldn't feel impotent. There are systematic things that we can do, both individually, collectively, and actions by governments. Okay, I'll stop there and now pass to Mark.
Hi, thank you, Rick. My name is Mark Boyle. I am Professor of Urban Studies at Liverpool University and also the Director of the Heseltine Institute, which is a public policy, city-facing institute with interests in climate change, one of the great public policy challenges, obviously, of the moment. As Rick said, the UK has dedicated itself in the light of the climate emergency to a net zero carbon 2050 target. We in Liverpool City Region are aiming for a 2040 target, and that is clearly a very ambitious public policy agenda, a big public policy goal that is going to be very challenging for us to meet, but one that we simply must remediate and address. I want to reflect here just very briefly on COVID. This was climate change, net zero carbon, transitioning to low carbon energy sources. This was a huge challenge up until yesterday. Now on top of this challenge, of course, COVID has aggravated the problems that humanity has to face. So I want to think a little bit about the relationships between COVID and the underlying climate change issue, and if COVID has made things worse or better, or in what ways has COVID fed into the necessity for us to deal with the global warming problem. So first of all, I want to say that there's immediate kind of issues, and there's some positives and negatives here. Positive benefits, of course, as many people talk about, this is the silver lining in the COVID cloud, is that there are some positive benefits, that massive state investment has been required to keep economies alive, and it's paved the way for discussions of a Green New Deal. Before this, we felt we could never spend that kind of scale of money, but we have, and we've showed it's possible for governments to do so. So it's paved the way, I suppose, for a mentality shift towards entertaining the idea of a Green New Deal more seriously. More people are walking and cycling. Energy consumption clearly has dropped. Transport carbon emissions have gone down, although not interestingly down as much as perhaps you might expect. Air pollution has improved, international air travel's declined, and people, I think, are more woke, to use the term of the moment, to the possibilities of a more sustainable life. So I think there's no doubt that in some perverse ways, COVID has created an environment in which addressing the climate crisis has achieved some kind of short-term boost. Nonetheless, there are clearly directly negative impacts of COVID also. It has delayed international agreements. We know that COP26, the annual meeting, the Conference of Parties, where climate legislation is agreed, has been delayed now till 2021. It was due to be held in Glasgow this year. We know that logging in Amazonia with the Bolsonaro government is now reaching epidemic levels. It's thwarted efforts to curb illegal loggers, and therefore deforestation of Amazonia is proceeding apace. It's deferred, cancelled investments in green infrastructure within some companies who are just trying to survive. At the moment, oil prices are down, oil's cheap. Single-use plastic production, not least through PPE equipment, is up. And of course, governments have had their bandwidth wholly occupied with the climate emergency, making it more difficult to prioritise or continue to prioritise global climate justice, global climate remediation. So COVID and its immediate impacts on the climate agenda and the net zero carbon 2050 agenda is complex. And it's not simply a matter of saying that COVID is some kind of small silver lining on the cloud. It has all sorts of negative and positive consequences and impacts, and is making it both more difficult and in some ways assisting the job of transitioning towards a lower carbon future. Now, I want just to finish by pointing out two bigger issues, and it's these more longer term structural issues that Rick referred to, which really keep me up at night. These are the things that really worry me. Those short term issues I've discussed will come and go as COVID waxes and wanes, but one hopes that by 2050 COVID will be a distant memory behind us, but climate will not, and dealing with climate change will remain a big issue. And to me, COVID and climate change have flushed out similar problems and actually require similar kinds of solutions. I call COVID Britain's barium meal. It's washed through the British system, flushed out some of the weaknesses, and these are the very same weaknesses that are going to cause us difficulty in moving towards a zero carbon future. They're to do with trust in governments, they're to do with social cohesion, they're to do with inequalities, they're to do with poverty. Structural aspects of society that are simultaneously problems for COVID and also for climate change. They're to do with science and lack of trust in by some political leaders in science, and back to this post-truth public realm that seems to bedevil us. Both climate change and COVID-19 require us to listen much more carefully and more authentically to the scientific community. And I think isolationism, political populism, we know in Britain, America, other places, is certainly undermining the kind of global leadership that we need, not only to solve COVID, but to solve the grand challenges of the 21st century, of which climate is clearly perhaps the main one. Rick, I'm going to finish there.
Thanks very much, Mark, for that reflective view on the challenges we face. And I now like to pass to Jenny, and who'll be providing an ecological perspective.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Jenny Hodgson. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Liverpool. My research is on ecology and biodiversity, looking at how species survive in human-dominated landscapes, like the one that you can see behind me, and what climate change might mean for how we help them to survive. So to understand the intersection between the problems of climate change and the problems of biodiversity, first a little bit of biology. We have millions of species across the globe, and each of them has evolved to live in a particular part of the globe. And a big part of what limits the edges of where they can survive is that they're adapted to a particular range of temperatures. What we are doing when we warm up the climate is obviously heating up the areas where each species is, and challenging what it's previously been adapted to over millions of years. So climate change particularly starts to make it difficult for species to survive at the warmer edges of their ranges, wherever that is over the globe. And we can see evidence of that already. One positive thing to note is that species do already have some abilities to adapt. They have some intrinsic resilience. A lot of species can cope, for example, with massive temperature variations over the seasons, and even from week to week. So we know they have some remarkable properties and abilities, but what we're doing now with climate change is pushing those abilities to the limit. And so ultimately, what can happen when a species experiences climate change? There's been research on this, including research that goes back into geological time to look at previous ice ages, to look at mass extinctions that we know happen in the deep history of the Earth. So, but we know broadly from these studies that species can sometimes evolve to cope with higher temperatures, but we know that this takes a long time. So past changes in climate across the Earth have taken hundreds of thousands or even millions of years. Now we're imposing that change very quickly within 100 years. The other thing species have done in the past is to actually shift across the globe when the climate changes. So when it gets warmer, species would shift towards the poles or up into mountainous areas. And when it gets colder again, they would shift back in the opposite direction. If species can't do either of these things or can't do them enough, they will die out, at least from parts of their range. And when their range becomes very small, they become vulnerable to other threats, particularly extreme events and any kind of threats that other threats that we know humans' activities pose to species. And when we predict forward what's likely to happen with the climate change, we also see that some of the environments species are currently adapted to may disappear altogether. There'll be nowhere else on the globe that has the same climate as, say, exactly the same climate as what there are at the top of tropical mountains right now. So how does conservation as a discipline respond to this unprecedented threat to species, which impinges everywhere in the globe? This is something that I've been thinking about in my research since around 2007. And broadly, I think that we need a multifaceted response. So conservation involves many different actions on a local level and on a national and very strategic level. The biggest thing to realize is the limitations of sort of isolated nature reserves, which have been one of the main planks of what we think of as conservation. We think of conservation as setting aside areas just for wildlife. And we've been doing that since the late 19th century. And it's had a great success rate. And we've now protected somewhere getting up to around 17% of the land area, which is a massive achievement for global conservation. But those nature reserves, as you might start to imagine, are still limited in scope. And when species are being pushed to move, they're not necessarily in the right places anymore. And although they cover in total, as I've said, 15 to 17% of the land area, by the way, they cover a lot less at sea. That area is very unevenly distributed across the globe. It's distributed particularly in places that are not in high demand from humans for farming and for cities. And what's left between those reserves are big gaps and big barriers and hostile areas that it's difficult for species to cross. So although we may be optimistic that we've seen species shift their range in the past, that was before humans modified the vast majority of landscapes to make them inhospitable to the vast majority of species. And so basically my work tries to plan for more sustainable landscapes landscapes that are permeable to species, even though they don't contain continuous tracts of natural habitat. In brief, I use modeling. Well, modeling is used to make sort of reasonable estimates about where species need to move and how far. And then we can look at the adequacy or inadequacy of the habitat network that they may be able to hop from patch to patch over time, over many, many generations, to get to somewhere which maintains the climate that that species is adapted to. So Rick already talked about just over 1 degree C rise in global mean temperature on land. That may not sound like much to a lot of us, but if we start to map out, okay, so here I'm at a particular place on the globe. Where on the globe would I have to go, which is on average 1.1 degrees C warmer? In many parts of the globe, that place that you'd have to go to is hundreds of kilometers away. So we really need to start thinking about conservation on much larger scales than we ever have before. And we need more habitat, both inside and outside reserves. We need more methods that can blend human activities while being hospitable to wildlife. And we need to think about the entire network rather than just a local site that a local team of people can try their best to save species there. I think that's mainly what I wanted to say, apart from the fact that if you're interested more, you can look at my personal page on the website or the website of my modelling project, condatis.org.uk. Cheers, thanks.
Thanks very much, Jenny, and thanks for translating that sense of a temperature change in terms of a spatial challenge that exists for our habitat in terms of how species will have to migrate. So now let's turn to Carl, who will talk about some of the solutions that might be on track and drawing on from an engineering perspective. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Carl Whittle from engineering. I am the Professor of Zero Carbon and Nuclear Energy Systems, and I look after or investigate in how to help provide the solutions to both climate change and the energy demands we're going to have in the next 50 years. So just looking quickly now, our electricity at the moment is about 60% coming from gas. If, as Mark says, we're going to meet net zero by 2050, we have to work out what to do with that 60% of the CO2 emissions coming from gas. If you look carefully at the rest of the energy mix, we have a mix provided from nuclear, wind, solar and biomass. If you look back to when COVID started during April, we were more wind than we were gas. That's the future, to have zero carbon energy where as much as possible. But that's just one side of it. It's also looking at how to implement these changes into the systems. So, for example, if we're going to change from natural gas for home heating, how are we going to heat homes in the winter? For example, do you want to use hydrogen gas in the pipeline, or do you want to go to electric storage heaters? Do we move from having large, big power stations, such as what Fiddler's Ferry was in Widnes, through to small, on top of the roof, solar panels and wind turbines? That's on the energy side. On the climate side, how can we live with climate changes? Do we move our houses to be higher up off the ground in regions of local flooding? On the transport side, how can we help to make transportation zero carbon? I've just said it's about that we have a significant portion of electricity with gas. A significant portion of the rest of the emissions comes from transport. Now, one of the trade-offs when we all went into lockdown, and it's changed slightly since, is that our transportation emissions went down. That was good for the planet. It was also, strangely enough, good for large organizations in that they did not use so much electricity or gas. However, it moved it to people at home who are working at home. So we have to work out how to implement changing energy landscapes and changing energy usage with regards to how people's lives will change over the next 20 to 30 years. That's also about how we deal with transport systems as well. And currently in any of your cars, or you will have a petrol or diesel engine more likely than anything else. over time, that needs to move away to be electricity, such as battery or hydrogen storage or hydrogen powered. We then have to provide the electricity to charge your car up, or the hydrogen to power your car or your bus or your train. And these are some of the solutions that we're looking at. And as I said before, even that's before living with climate change, on how to make housing better, to make it more insulated, to make it more energy efficient and less energy wasteful. That helps your bills. It also helps our generating requirement to be much less. So I think after that, Rick, I'll pass back to you.
Thanks very much, Carl. So now we move to the question and answer phase. We've got a few questions in, but do use those facilities, Q&A boxes or the comments boxes to put any queries for the panel. So let's start off with a question from Mike Ballinger, which I'm going to pass to Mark. How do schools influence children to change their and their parents' wasteful habits without frightening them and risking their mental health?
Thank you, Mike. That's a tough question to start with. It covers lots of bases. This is a great question. This is obviously really crucial because a question, I think, further down to, I'm not sure who, is it Carol perhaps asked the third question down about how to galvanise public support as well. It kind of speaks to the same issues. People have preoccupied with the pressures of everyday life. They've got tremendous issues just to survive all the vicissitudes of everyday pressures, not least in the turbulent economic times in which we live. So getting people to think green, I think, getting kids to think green, who will, after all, be the future generation is pivotal. I would point to a couple of things that I think are important here. One is carbon literacy. I think that above all else, the way to try to educate, I mean, you can't educate the public in terms of being finger wagging or, overly moralizing, but equipping people with an understanding of their carbon footprint and getting us carbon literate so we know, well, actually, by taking the bus here or by using this building in this way, we have some control. And it gives us a sense of empowerment that this is not some huge global challenge that's running away from us and it's too big for us. I think if we know our immediate carbon footprint, and you see this with fitness, people running down the street and heart monitors and wearables, as they refer to. We need something like that where people have constant self-understanding of the carbon emissions that their everyday lives are, and the buildings they work in, their workplaces, the transport routes they take, and I think that's really key. I also think that there's an appetite. I mean, one of the benefits of COVID, we were already moving before COVID away from this kind of relentless, frenetic kind of capitalist growth of GVA being all that matters and growing the economy. And I think people are taking stock and they're thinking about what they're doing with their life and the meaning of their life. And you only pass this way once, and what are we using the best of the time that's available to us? So there's an openness to wellness and well-being and thinking more broadly about the other beyond economy kind of aspirations that society must. I think to influence kids, to influence the public, we should be tapping into that openness to contemplate new behaviours, new lifestyles at this particular historical moment. Rick, I want to say something in a minute about population growth, because someone asked a very good question on that, but I'll stop there and let someone else come in for now.
Okay, sorry. I'd just like to add to what Mark said, and part of the response must be providing a more informed view of what's happening. So one thing the university does is the geology Earth Sciences Department sets up training sessions for school teachers about some of the issues affecting the Earth system. And I think that sort of engagement of providing a more up-to-date view of pressing issues is one way we can help. There are also nearly all, a whole range of departments at the university run outreach sessions. Our school certainly does, where we go into schools and try and provide a more informed view. And so I think a hope is that information rather than scaremongering has to be a way forward here. So to next question we're going to pick up. So a related question is from Carol Robinson. To get change, there needs to be widespread public support. So how can the public not only be convinced that climate change is real, but also that we all need to make changes to our lives? Well, I'll kick off on that. To be convinced that climate change is real, I think the data is showing that now. I think when I first started looking at this problem 20, 30 years ago, there's still a sense that some of the events that people were attributing to climate change were just inter-annual variability. But year on, or decade by decade, the planet is getting warmer. The oceans are getting, taking up more carbon, so becoming slightly more acidic. The summer sea ice in the Arctic is retreating, and there are ecological changes, as Jenny was talking about. So the evidence is there that it's real. How do we, and so, I think that's the first part of that. Anything else you'd want to add, I guess, Mark, to that question? To get change, there needs to be widespread public support.
Yeah, I was just saying briefly, and Jenny, I think might want to come in. Back beyond the carbon literacy question and understanding the actual population is receptive at this particular historical moment. I don't think marketing campaigns, I don't think this is a matter of necessarily cascading knowledge down through the system. I mean, that definitely helps. But I think marketing alone isn't going to do this. I think incentives from government, create incentive structures, make people begin to understand actually it's in their interests, and for these reasons it's in their interests, to think more seriously about environmental concerns, to change the car, to change their mode of transport, and so on. We need to provide financial, fiscal kind of incentives, to get an environment in which the public is able to understand these, the value of these shifts to them, and why it's in their interests to do so. And yeah, I mean, every marketing campaign I see talks about, marketing alone is not going to cut it. It needs to be driven by resource allocation issues, by wider, deeper structural issues. It's educating the leadership cadre within cities. It's making sure that a small number, just by educating 1,000 people in Liverpool, that can make all the difference to 1 million people in Liverpool, because those people control information, public relations, and so on. So I think it's a much more complex issue than simply cascading and exposing information, and it requires us to think much more about incentive structures within which the public operate. I think Jenny was wanting to.
Yes, Jenny, would you like to add from a more environmental ecological perspective?
Yes, not so much. I was going to say something quite similar to what Mark just said, which is, and it's coming up in the chat as well, in the questions that I can see, that people with more power need to take more leadership, but they also are influenced by public opinion. So influencing public opinion goes hand in hand and does help. All I was going to say is that what we need to do is to stop taking the fossil fuels out of the ground. And there are different, there are some quite simple, though drastic, ways of doing that. And yes, I don't think it's fair to place the burden of responsibility on everybody to reduce their energy usage, although that does help. And going to a more vegetable-filled diet also helps with the climate issue and with the loss of habitat issue as well.
Great, thanks, Jenny. So another question from this time Brian Finney. In 1950, the world's population was 2.5 billion. It is estimated that we will get to 9 billion. Isn't this the primary cause of man-made climate change? So I guess I'll kick off on that. Basically, there's no doubt that the pressures on the environment, population growth is a big factor. But there are different ways we can live our lives. We can live our lives in a very carbon intensive way, an energy intensive way, or we can organize ourselves to reduce our environmental footprint. So there are different ways of addressing this. Simply to say it's population growth and the carbon footprint is inevitable, that needn't necessarily follow. Carl, is there anything you'd want to add on that?
I guess my immediate response was, if we were starting now, we wouldn't start from this place with our energy generation and usage. We would try and scale up and minimize what we need to use and how we're generating it. And over time, there have been moves to more carbon efficient ways of developing or generating electricity, such as moving from coal to gas. It's cleaner, it's better for the environment. But it's not really, I wouldn't say as much as our population growth that is the reason why. I think it's our energy usage that is the reason why. It's how we're using energy. If you go back to the 50s, car ownership was much less. And it's those types of things there. I think that would be how I would answer it anyway.
Thanks, Carl. So then Ian asked about the levers that we can choose to make our world more sustainable. And so for each presenter, what 3 priorities should we focus on? So I'll kick off, because otherwise my contributions would be taken by someone else. So I would say, buying less, the way we consume goods is a big driver for our energy and carbon footprint. I would say eat less meat or don't eat meat. That's a huge imprint on the system. And in terms of the other actions, I think ultimately change is only going to come through governments, and I think they do respond to public pressure. So talking to friends and colleagues about this issue and convincing them of the importance of this issue is the other action I would advocate. Jenny, how about you? What are the 3 that you would advocate?
Sorry, 3. I was reading a different question. Sorry. The 3 biggest recommendations. 3 levers that can be moved to make our world more sustainable. It's a tricky one. I think, although I'm not an economic expert, economic levers to make it more expensive to use fossil fuels, however you do that, and less expensive to do the other things, avoiding perverse incentives to destroy the environment, to overuse resources when that's not necessary. So the food is historically cheap for us at the moment, and the cost of food doesn't reflect the true environmental cost of growing it. Similarly with transport. And obviously, while you change those things, you also have to support people who can't basically afford to spend more. So there was another question about rural transport and things like that. But I think governments are thinking about these things. It is on the agenda of the IPCC, for example, saying how do we move fast enough, but at the same time protect those who are vulnerable. That includes protecting people who live in drought-prone or flood-prone areas, as well as people who would economically suffer if prices suddenly went up.
Okay, thanks very much, Jenny. So more Mark and then Carl, but we've got quite a few other questions coming in now. So maybe one recommendation each.
Thank you, Rick. That got me out of trouble there. I can get to one, I think, and not three. Yeah, to me, this is a much bigger issue. And it goes back to the previous question. And I do want to come back to that population question, because I think it's a really important one. But it's the design of the economy. I mean, I'd hate to be one of these, whatever it is, lefty, whatever. You need a fundamental shift to the economy, but simply that's what we need. I mean, we're not. If you look at COVID, just think how much we've cut back on life, and we're nowhere near zero carbon at this stage. So how the heck are we going to get to zero carbon by 2050 or 2040? If even at the lowest level and lowest ebb during COVID. Well, it's clear that it's not going to happen, and a lot of it's rhetoric, political rhetoric. Politicians will not be around to be held accountable in 2050, so they can say, in many senses, what they want at the moment. If we're serious about this, we need to look at the anatomy of the structure of the economy, and we need to look, as Jenny said, at incentive structures, at costs, about incentivizing perverse, humanity's war on planet Earth. It's not just capitalism, and because China, what is China? Half capitalism, half I mean, who knows what China is? But it's not just a capitalist problem. But we aren't going to be able to address this unless we have a really deep look at the key drivers within the system, about this inexorable growth, inexorable abuse of nature in the interest of capturing resources, and then not worrying about the pollution that follows as a consequence. So I think it's the design of markets. People who can design markets, incentivize markets, I think are going to be key. Thanks,
Mark. So Carl?
Just a quick answer, because thankfully you've all answered the question with points I was going to raise. But one point is, in the short term, the governments can invest in accelerating technology take-up for energy generation, energy usage, and energy reduction by investing now, so we can get the technologies in place and used. We can evolve and improve over time, but we need people to start using them now. And that's whether it's insulating houses, retrofitting houses, supporting electric charging station for cars, hydrogen fuel, whatever you want to call it. They need to start now and accept it's going to be a 20 to 30 year payoff before they start probably generating significant money back again.
Thanks, Carl. That also addresses a question from Cleo, which was asking about the housing adaptations that we need to address to deal with climate change. anything you'd want to add on that? I know that the heating systems for houses, that's a big challenge in reducing our carbon footprint, at least within the UK.
Yeah, it's a significant challenge, and it's not just in, say, Liverpool city centre or Manchester or London. It's also in the middle of the Yorkshire Dales, in the middle of the Scottish Highlands. You still have houses that still require heating. It's retrofitting, putting in insulation, making them more energy efficient, using roof space for solar panels, using garden or poles to put wind turbines in. You can make it more energy efficient locally, to the point it's the house that's more efficient. That then reduces the energy required within the house, therefore reduces the energy required that we need to generate, and actually makes it more cost effective for the people living there. How energy, it's not equal access to energy, it's called equitable access to energy. You can have houses in the UK that will not live in all the rooms because they can't afford to heat them, so they will live in the centre of the house and let the natural air provide insulation within the house to the outside world.
Great. So then a question from Catherine Gibson. Has there been a noticeable change in emissions during lockdown? And I can address that one. So there's been a lot of focus on this. Over the first 80 days of lockdown, there was actually a 30% reduction in the UK daily CO2 emissions. Averaged over the globe, it was about 17%. So that made a big difference. There was a 90% drop in aviation and a 50% drop in transport led to that 30% reduction. So that gives us a sense of what behavioural change can deliver. And so that should, we should be aware of how our individual choices can make a difference. Having said that, you can almost turn it the other way around. If you remember back to the first 80 days of lockdown, where it really was a lockdown, 70% of our emissions were still remaining. And so that really highlights the challenge that we face, that we've got to embark on much more fundamental changes to how we produce energy and consume energy in the ways that Carl has touched on, in order to address this problem. We really need, to systematically be facing up to this challenge. Okay, and another question that's come in is that, and this is, I'm going to pass this one to Jenny. Someone is saying that in 100 years' time, polar bears would be extinct. How extreme would the changes be for each of us to do to stop that occurring? I don't know if you want to take that one, Jenny.
It's a really hard question, but as I read it, it's not so specifically about polar bears. It's asking the ultimate question of how much is enough? Right? How do we know when we've done enough and succeeded in this challenge? And it's something I often ask myself, and I think it's extremely difficult to answer. What I think the most important thing is to be moving in the right direction rather than the wrong direction. Actually, sadly, I think that we can't avoid all the extinctions that our past actions have kind of made very probable. And it's super hard question in conservation because we know we've brought some species back from the brink of extinction. We've brought some, in a handful of famous examples, brought species back from there being just a handful of individuals in the whole world. But that was a very expensive process. And now with the scale of change, we don't think we can afford to do that for all species. But we need to retain hope that we can have functioning ecosystems and that we can maintain as many of the species as possible to go on to evolve to do what this amazing planet has evolved to do. So yeah, I'm gonna, that's maybe avoiding the question, but I think if you're looking for one single answer of what you need to do, that whatever answer I give is going to be the wrong.
Thanks, Jenny. Related questions to Carl on, as we from Carol Robinson and Sarah Kettle, as we replace gas with wind power, there will be a need to store energy. Will batteries, hydrogen, or something else be the answer? And from Sarah Kettle, how ready is hydrogen to support the transition?
You're correct about storage. We will need more storage, but it's not just limited to batteries and hydrogen. There's hydroelectric storage, and there are other means of storing the energy, as it were. You could use mechanical methods, for example. The batteries are getting better and provide more charge density and can store more energy. And hydrogen, you can generate from two common sources. One is it's referred to as steam methane reformation, but that requires carbon capture and storage. The other one is electrolysis, where you take electricity, pass it through water, and then you get hydrogen at the end, and you can store that as a compressed gas. That's one way. That they will grow with time. They just need to have more and more investment as well on that, but not significant amount. It's now just scaling up. With regards to, can hydrogen provide the support now? It definitely could do. We have trains that will run on hydrogen when they can't run under the wires. Alstom in Runcorn Way will have trains that can run on hydrogen when they can't run under the wires. So if you're running from, say, Liverpool to, let's say, Scarborough, there's a significant portion of that does not run under the electric wires. You're running now as a diesel engine. You could convert that to run on a hydrogen, an electric train with a hydrogen engine to pick up those regions. You could also use batteries or hydrogen for long-term or long-distance lorry driving. So the Eddie Stobbarts, the Tesco's of this world can use hydrogen-based trucks to travel around the UK, thus reducing the diesel footprint significantly, and yet providing the mileage necessary to do the distance driving that they need to do. Or and linked with that, you can use more intermodal rail so that the trailers can go onto the back of trains and go all the way up to north of Scotland, which is what Tesco's were doing last year. There are many different methods for doing this, and they can all pick up the pieces to start doing now. But there's one key difference. With an electric powered car, you can plug it in your house. With a hydrogen refueling hydrogen powered car, you need a refueling point, and they need to be dispersed around the country. And that is what I was talking about earlier about the capital investment needs to be done now. It's the next bit is hopefully a quick bit, and that should cover everything, I hope. Is with hydrogen, you need the capital investment now, but the increasing capital investment with increasing uptake goes down proportionally. With electric cars and battery powered devices, you can buy them now and the grid will cope. But if 4 million cars go from being internal combustion to being electric only, we now have to charge 4 million cars, or we change entirely how we transport people around and goods. And that's when the big change will come. So at that point, we then have to increase our electricity generation to charge up the cars that the people are using, or we don't use cars so much.
Thanks very much, Carl. And so another question from Doug Mayer, maybe for Mark. Some argue that the economic models of the global economy have to change to recognize that there should be a higher cost attributed to the use of non-renewable natural resources, including fossil fuels. Have you any views on how that might work?
Yeah, I think Doug's question is the key, is the killer question. It has to look at the economic growth, has to look at why GDP continues to be hugely important to some people. Endless growth. I think obviously the fiscal issue is tax and taxing the fossil fuel heavy energy sources, subsidising some of the alternative energy sources, incentivising investments in green technology and green energy, providing tax benefits and so on for companies who are making that transition. But the difficulty is countries find it difficult to do this alone, because a dirty industry who uses a lot of fossil fuel, if they can't do it in one country because of legal or fiscal constraints, we're just moving to the next country if that country hasn't also legislated. So the key issue for me, for Doug's question, is global leadership, and it's back to the point of the absence of this vacuum in global connectivity, global communities around COVID, around this is getting worse, clearly because of the growth of political populism, and we've moved to a more isolationist kind of world. And I'm afraid the grand challenges of the moment, that kind of political decentralism is not going to be effective, and it's only by a coordinated global community tackling the problems, say, of readjusting the economy and creating new fiscal rules. It can only be done universally. The challenge, of course, is countries like China complain that they have been they're at an earlier stage of industrialization, and they should not be held to account in the same way until they have sufficiently developed. And that's the difficulty. At what point do you give everyone the same kind of targets? Now, I saw China yesterday, I think, set a net zero carbon 2060, which is incredible development of the United Nations yesterday. So China's already, notwithstanding its coal-fired economy and fuel-fired economy, beginning to take seriously the idea of arranging its economy around much more green energy sources. Can I say one more thing about population? I'm determined to get this in, haven't I? Or do you want me to stop now?
We've got 2 minutes.
I'll stop now. I'll stop now and give you.
We will go for a wrap-up statement by each of you, so you can use it for that.
Okay.
Right. So thanks, everyone. I hope everyone's enjoyed it. I just want to finish by each of us providing a final view to you all. So I'll kick off, and then it can be Mark, Jenny, and Carl. So my view is, this is the challenge of our generation, to try and address this and move towards a more sustainable future. The university is trying to do its bit. Climate and environmental research is spread across the university. We're trying to bring those activities together under this Climate Futures Research Challenge. And as importantly, we're trying to draw upon underlying discipline strengths, such as in chemistry or in engineering or in computer science, to help to develop the solutions that we need to move to a low carbon future. So Mark, next.
Yeah, so I'll keep this brief. Thomas Malthus, a population person who predicted that we would outrun the resources available on the planet. He was writing in 1798. Now, 1798, the population of England and Wales was 8.5 million, and the population of the planet was 900 million. Today, of course, England and Wales is 56.5 million, and the planetary population is 7.7. So it's definitely not just a population issue, it's the economy, it's the structure of the economy and so on. But I think the point that was made earlier is we must realise that we've gone from a situation where the whole of the earth, in time of Christ, was 200 million people, twice the size of Britain and France together. That's it. That's the only population on the earth. Within 2,000 years, we've reached 7.7 billion, possibly going to 10 billion by 2100. So I think population is an issue allied with the economic structure of the the economy.
Thanks very much, Mark. So Jenny, a final thought from you?
Well, mainly I'd like to thank everyone for their questions. They were really thought-provoking and I enjoyed reading them. I hope it was an informative session for everybody. I think I think there is a great deal of public understanding and a great deal of initiative to try to do things, and we need to try to hold on to that as that actions on a small scale will add up to make a big difference. And you can see that with habitat restoration on a small scale. You can see it with sustainable farming on a small scale. You can also see it with economic models for payments to preserve the environment on a small scale. What we haven't quite managed to do is to scale that up to make a big difference to these global forces that let's be honest, that we are a species, we were evolved to deal with small problems, not these big ones.
Thanks very much, Jenny. And finally, Carl.
I think the biggest thing going forward is it's not just technological change, it's societal and policy change as well. We can develop the best electric vehicle tomorrow, but if it costs £250,000, nobody's going to be able to buy it. It needs to be an investment from both the government and from us to help drive the change. And that's the key point. And I think we can make net zero by 2050. It might be 2050, but I think we can do it by 2050.
Thanks very much, Carl. So to conclude the session, I hope we've enjoyed trying to react to your own questions, and we hope the audience have enjoyed it as well. Apologies to any questions we skipped. It got a bit overwhelming. What we will be planning on doing is having further conversations on particular topics over the next 6 months or year, where different experts will talk more in depth about the societal response, the underlying science, or some of the prospective solutions that the university are engaged in. Okay, and on that note, thank you very much and stay safe.